Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog here on Mint Press with me, Lowkey. We, of course, are going against the grain, covering stories which are regularly marginalized, ignored, and ghettoized outside the eyesight and the earshot of the masses by mainstream media. For that reason, we really appreciate any support you can give. So please do like, share, and subscribe and comment on this video, but also follow us on Telegram, where we can be sure to reach you at all times, away from the algorithmic suppression of the big social media companies, which actually a lot of our work is exposing now on a daily basis. So we're joined today by, some may perceive him to be a controversial guest, somebody who has really written at length about much of the structures of power within our society. He has brought some pretty extraordinary scoops recently to the public sphere. I'm talking about Kit Klarenberg of the Grey Zone and many other places. Kit, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. That was a harsh intro, I think, in many ways. But no, I understand. I understand where you're coming from. No, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, man. So
My
the
pleasure.
first question I wanted to ask you, we've seen a massive mobilization of forces to sweep aside Boris Johnson, the Conservative Prime Minister, somebody who many of us were active against in trying to bring in Jeremy Corbyn in that period of time. And we saw the complete unity of the ruling class in fighting Corbyn and putting all of their energy into thrusting Boris Johnson. But in quite a short period of time, we saw an intense turnaround in the feeling towards him, as if there was this sort of collective realization that he was somehow a liar, that he was somebody who was beyond reproach, that he was somebody who morally was beneath public life. When this is somebody that is believed to have hidden his fatherhood of children, to have denied children when it comes to his private life. This is somebody who was alleged groped the journalist and wife of major journalist on TV on a daily basis. Of course, talking about the situation where he was accused by the wife of Robert Peston of groping her. We know of there's a multitude of cases where his personal digressions have been revealed and exposed in major ways. But it sort of seemed that there was this very artificial to me awakening about his personality, and then the focusing on that to use these means to sweep him out of power. But I think it would be great if we can have a bit of a context on where all this has come from and what the sort of historical precedents for this type of operation could be. So if we take it back to the 20s and we look at the development of this kind of stuff, we have an example of quite a clear push to interfere in the quote unquote democratic process in this country taking place with Ramsay MacDonald. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please, Kit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in 1923 was people often think that the very first Labour government was Clement Attlee's, kind of 1945 post-war. I mean, that was the first majority Labour government. The actual first Labour government was Ramsay MacDonald's in 1923. It was a minority government. It very quickly, despite not possessing the requisite foot soldiers in Parliament, which would normally allow you to do this, attempted to undertake really quite seismic, sweeping reforms to the kind of socio-economic and political fabric of the United Kingdom. Heading in, Donald called an election the next year in 1924. I mean, and I think that actually in many ways the context then is very similar to now. So this was, following the Soviet revolution, this was a time when and yes, the kind of post-World War One Red Scare in both Britain and America. This was a time when there, accusations that people were in bed with the Russians, abounded. Dissent was brutally cracked down upon. It was framed as, oh, well, you're secretly a communist, and blah blah. And so, leading up to this election, there was the release of what was called the Xenov Letter, which at the time was taken seriously, and it was allegedly a kind of communication from a senior Soviet official, which was to the Labour Party, which was talking about how, when you get in, this is going to be fantastic because the British working class will radicalize, they'll revolutionize, and then you will experience in Britain what we experienced in what was formerly the Russian Empire. And I mean, yes, as I say, it was taken seriously at the time. It very much appears now that it was the construct of British intelligence. It had a significant impact on the vote and led to a landslide Conservative victory. I mean, there are shades in this as well in 2019, Jeremy Corbyn publicized some documents which were, it was the US-UK provisional trade deal, which showed that following Brexit, that the NHS was going to be carved up into pieces and sold to the highest American bidder, which was that this was framed as an attempt at Russian meddling, and then very quickly the onus of the story shifted from, well, this is an absolutely horrific death sentence for socialized medicine in the UK, to, oh, well, actually, the real focus here is that this is, the Russians behind this, so the substance of the documents doesn't really matter. So yeah, I mean, I think that just goes to show that yes, that there is a lot, an extensive and egregious history of the intelligence services meddling in general elections, and it raises very obvious questions about, yes, the degree to which the UK is actually a democracy, and who is actually in power and in whose interest power is actually exerted.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jonathan Pyle, actually, in his book Churchill's Secret Enemy, delved into the details of a gentleman by the name Sir George Joseph Bull, his career as an MI5 officer. And it is the assertion of Jonathan Pyle, based on his research, where he had very wide access to a lot of Sir George Joseph Bull's papers and archives. And Pyle makes this assertion that actually it was Bull at the time that he was an MI5 officer and others who were responsible for this fake letter. So we see this kind of astroturfing happening. Now, another case that would be interesting to look at is Operation Clockwork Orange and the campaign against Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, and it's again, there are very clear parallels here. It's they never change the script, do they? But so essentially, in the 1970s, after Labour won, a very narrow victory in February 1974, and then went on to win a just as narrow victory in October that year. This was also concurrent with the running of the intelligence war in Northern Ireland being handed to MI5. Prior to that, from the late 60s onwards, there was a tussle over who had responsibility for that particular operation, and it created a very bizarre situation whereby kind of special branch MI6 and MI5, because of the kind of unique and unparalleled position that Northern Ireland occupied within the UK constitutional structure, were all arguing over who had ultimate responsibility for trying to take down Irish republicanism. And so MI5 gets complete control like right around the time that a effectively minority Labour government is elected in the late 1974. It was, I think, they had a majority of 3, which is, not particularly effective. And so the Clockwork Orange was an attempt by MI5 operating out with the kind of, or from the grey zone, one might say, not a reference to my employer, but the grey zone of Northern Ireland, an attempt to smear British politicians of every stripe, whether they were, Labour, Conservative, Liberal, but with a particular focus on Harold Wilson. And it's very clear from Peter Wright's disclosures in Spycatcher, that book that the Thatcher government tried to ban, and then that it turned it into an international bestseller, even if it is very boring. That they genuinely believed that Harold Wilson was a KGB operative or asset, and they were engaged in a large number of plots to try and take him down. I mean, in the spirit of 2 Degrees of Separation, Airey Neave, who was a World War II veteran, The Great Escape is largely based on his escape from Colditz, long-time British intelligence operative. He was the Northern Ireland secretary in Thatcher's shadow cabinet, was killed by by Inler in the late 70s, but allegedly, he spoke openly about how, well, if there is any prospect of Tony Benn becoming prime minister, then there is a need to assassinate him. So it was a very, very, very strange time, with intelligence agencies battling it out with one another, and fairly openly trying to undermine democratic governments. I think that in the spirit of a Thomas Pynchon novel, almost, Harold Wilson was incredibly paranoid. There were events like British Army drills at Heathrow Airport. There were several over the course of the 70s, and he took this as a kind of run through for a military coup. There were several purported private military companies run by people like David Sterling, who was the forefather of the SAS, who were openly talking in the media. What the extent to which that was substantive and serious is another question, but openly talking about seizing power in the event that a Labour government lost control due to the enormous industrial strife of the era. So I mean, again, this is an example of intelligence services very clearly demonstrating that they think that they're in charge of everything, and attempting to contort and manipulate politics in their own interests.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the interesting thing about Harold Wilson is it's largely believed that the MI5 had a file on him, using the sort of fake name of Henry Worthington, from the 40s. And, as you mentioned, that Peter Wright memoir, Spycatcher, he actually mentions that James Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence division, had told him not only that Wilson was a Soviet agent, but that actually the KGB had murdered Hugh Gateskill.
Yes, poisoned him.
Wilson in power. And at one point, Wilson actually spoke to Barry Penrose and Roger Korcheff from the BBC, and he told them quite plainly that the intelligence services were acting against him. But it wasn't just Wilson that said this. You also had MI5 agent James Miller and a former military intelligence employee in Northern Ireland, Colin Wallace. Brilliant documentary about Colin Wallace and his trials and tribulations. The Man Who Knew Too Much is available on YouTube. And it was Colin Wallace that actually was the first to draw attention to this Operation Clockwork Orange, the notes that he'd made while he was briefed on this. And the interesting aspect of it, especially when thinking about the last 6 months in British politics, is the sort of drip feed, attritional warfare process, this idea of leaking stories gradually to affect the public mood around this kind of stuff. I mean, and also the really ironic thing about Harold Wilson's time is that it was in 68 while he was actually prime minister, that you had the spy corps, the special demonstration squad, established as a unit following the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign's protests outside the US Embassy, which ended up smashing some windows, and then subsequently the infiltration of 1,000 different political groups, from the Fire Brigades Union to the National Union of Teachers to an organization called Eat Out Vegan Wales, to anti-fur campaigns, to Houseman's Bookshop, to the Rebel Clown Army, to Veggies Catering Nottingham, to an organization that rescued hedgehogs in Scotland. This is what happened under Harold Wilson's watch, essentially. So all of this kind of articulates quite clearly is almost how inconsequential the political players are when it comes to the actions of the state vis-a-vis surveillance and whatnot. And so the next question I kind of wanted to go on to was, you've published really brilliant and important work recently on this push to actually bring Boris in and get Theresa May taken out around Brexit. Could you tell us about that, please, Kit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, I mean, the story kind of starts in mid 2018, which is, I mean, it feels, you know, many lifetimes ago now. But that, yeah, this was a period when both Labour and the Conservatives were signed up to leaving the European Union. There was no question about that publicly, really. You know, Theresa May had the previous year gone for a general election expecting to be returned on, you know, this in excess of Thatcher's kind of 1983 majority. It was going to be a landslide, and then she would, you know, she would take out the saboteurs and get the UK out of the EU. And in the event, Jeremy Corbyn came within 2,500 votes of being prime minister, but we can't talk about that. But like, yeah, that essentially that this was the kind of ground zero for, I think, a number of intelligence operations, both pro and both pro-Leave and pro-Remain. And essentially, you know, at this, you know, in June 2018, Theresa May releases her Chequers deal, which was effectively, you know, EU membership in everything but name only. Like it was on, I think the thing was on the principle of limited managed withdrawal, and there are a number of you know, prominent Brexiteers who were very opposed to this. After it was announced, Boris Johnson, you know, as foreign secretary, he quit. David Davis, who was the Brexit secretary, quit. And then little did we know, but in the background, and this is what the leaked emails I reported on for the Grey Zone have exposed, there were these, you know, these hardline, I mean, that doesn't really do it justice, hard Brexiteers who wanted out, you know, by any means necessary on zero terms, in order to start extricating the UK in every conceivable way from anything resembling European legislation, European regulations, etc. I mean, this, I call them the cabal, and I think it's rather opposite. It's a group of, you know, elite military and intelligence figures, you know, including Richard Dearlove, who was the head of MI6 during the Iraq War and was personally responsible for the dissemination of all manner of false intelligence related to Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction capability. Gwyddion Prince, who's a key you know, long-time NATO advisor, long-time chief of defence staff advisor, and a variety of, you know, wealthy, largely unknown backers. Probably the most famous is Jeremy Blackwell, who is the, you know, the head of the Blackwell publishing empire. And they set out to, yes, by any means necessary, remove Theresa May from office, traduce, ostracize, publicly shame pro-Remain groups. This is also when People's Vote starts getting quite a lot of traction. You know, Best for Britain, you know, the push for a second referendum, which seems, and I have articles coming on this, seems to have been very much an intelligence operation to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, or at least stop his Downing Street aspirations dead in their tracks. And so, yeah, they proposed all manner of elaborate schemes and plots to publicly disgrace high-profile Remainers, infiltrating the civil service, in order to block their Romania quote-unquote deal, setting up fake campaign groups in order to infiltrate people's vote, etc., and gather dirt on them. They were relentless, and I mean, they had spies within the civil service who were handing them sensitive, classified information. And I mean, it was this multi-pronged assault in order to, get rid of Theresa May. And then, kind of towards the end of 2019, these people discuss in what they thought was fully encrypted, never to be read by anyone else, emails, how Boris Johnson had started a leadership campaign. They were coordinating with him directly. Richard Dearlove was giving Boris advice on Huawei, the Chinese tech giant, which seems to have been followed. That they were really, really, really pushing him in a variety of different directions and sending private briefings to Michael Gove and Steve Baker. Interestingly, Steve Baker was one of the loudest, most prominent voices calling for Johnson to resign, as was David Davis, who the cabal was in direct contact with. And so, they thought very highly of their interventions, and subsequent to Boris becoming prime minister, they were talking about their success in doing this. And I mean, it's kind of difficult to quantify, but it just seems to me that there is Britain, particularly in the kind of post-empire period, there's an enormous amount of military and intelligence veterans who sit around with not very much to do. And I mean, what might you get up to in that context? Try and distort and contour and manipulate politics, for your own ends, mightn't you? And so, I mean, it was. I published several articles on this. I mean, I think that this is an ongoing, if not never-ending story. In late 2020, they seem to have given up on Boris pretty comprehensively, because he didn't quite deliver the Singapore-on-Thames Brexit deal that they were, hoping for and expecting. And due to his fairly sizable public spending, they assumed that he was a Blairite social democrat globalist, which is obviously ludicrous. But they from about that point onwards, they start talking about the need to get rid of him and replace him either with someone like Liz Truss or Priti Patel. They've had direct contact with Priti Patel. Gwydion Prince, who I mentioned, had a secret meeting with her where he outlined his plans to carry out a vicious counterintelligence operation targeting environmental activists, which involved digging up dirt on their sexual proclivities and relationships. And I mean, a normal person, when presented with this, might think, well, these people are insane and need to get away from them as fast as possible. Patel expressed an interest in staying in touch and asked for a personal proton mail to be set up for her so they could speak secretly. Prince, who is certifiably insane, referred to Patel as a refreshing change from the current soggy mass of politicians. Priti Patel, who's advocated starving the Irish, wanted to send aid to medical camps in the Golan Heights, where Israel provides treatment to wounded ISIS fighters. I mean, you can see why they're kind of on the same page. I mean, Patel is, quite interestingly, in an email from February this year, Richard Dearlove refers to how she's secretly engaged in a leadership campaign. Now, of course, Priti is regarded as a hardcore Johnson loyalist. There's been no indication publicly that she has any aspirations to become leader. I mean, I'm not even sure whether she is running now. She seems to have announced her candidacy and said she would be the only truly authentic Brexit candidate, and then now she's pulled out. I mean, whether that's cold feet because of our reporting, which is a very flattering idea, but or alternatively, maybe she realizes that she would be inheriting such a poison chalice. I mean, if the leadership election is due to terminate in kind of early September, and there are suggestions that a general election should be called thereafter, you are dealing with a spiraling cost of living crisis, historically high inflation, which will be well into the double digits by that point. ongoing crisis in Ukraine, just a welter of, and also yes, the need to renegotiate Boris's oven-ready Brexit deal, which is actually completely unworkable. You wouldn't choose to you wouldn't sign up to resolve any of that, because I don't think it can be resolved. This is a looming catastrophe which you are going to be intimately associated with if and when it kicks off.
Absolutely. You've also had this move against Boris. There's been a great piece written by Mr. Norton Taylor in the Classified UK just today that has come out, and it points to the role of what he describes as the permanent government in sweeping aside Boris Johnson. An interesting aspect, which is not mentioned in the piece, but that I remembered from the very early days of these machinations against Boris Johnson, the purported leader of the pork pie conspiracy, or pork pie coup, as it was being touted by mainstream media, was Alicia Kearns, who is the MP for Rutland and Melton. She won in the 2019. She got her position there. This is somebody who formerly was not only, an employee of NATO, hosting the TV production of the NATO summit. She was also a senior press officer at the Ministry of Defense. She was also the director of a PR company called Global Influence. Now, according to Global Influence, their clients have been the US State Department, the British Foreign Office, and NATO. Now, Alicia Kearns, right before the operations in Ukraine began, actually took her family to Ukraine on a fact-finding mission, as the average MP for Rutland and Melton might do.
And the average mother as well. This is something you would do.
Yes, absolutely. Bizarre. But, at the same time, you had figures also like Tobias Ellwood, who was extremely animated in his opposition to Boris Johnson. This is somebody who, simultaneous to being the head of the Select Committee on Defence, also is an MP, but also is a reservist, a lieutenant, actually reservist in the 77th Brigade, which is the British Army's psychological warfare unit. Of course, you also have Rory Stewart, another figure who has been reported by the Daily Telegraph as high-ranking security figures supposedly have referred to him as former MI6. We also know that Rory Stewart's his organization in Afghanistan has very interesting crossover with former intelligence figures and also people who are simultaneously employed by his organization in Afghanistan, Turquoise Mountain, and the Saudi government at the same time. So these are people with very interesting connections who did not seem to have any reservations about going publicly very, very hard at the Prime Minister, which in almost any other circumstance, you would have the argument put against that as being, this is bad for national unity, you're detracting from the fight against COVID, you're detracting from this, but there was absolutely no reservation of that sort. What's your feeling about the move against Boris Johnson?
Well, yes, it's a miraculous turnaround, isn't it? It doesn't seem that long ago that we were being blasted with relentless pro-Boris propaganda and, kind of elevating him to almost kind of a godlike figure who was in control of everything and was going to rescue us all from all of, from COVID, from the war in Ukraine and all these other issues. I think that he's for a very long time been disliked, probably since long before he came into office. He's been disliked by the intelligence services. You referred to a drip. I mean, one of the things I find quite interesting is that Byline Times, which is an outlet which does seem to reflect the security services line in most matters, they were publishing throughout 2020, investigations on corruption, which subsequently drip 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 became the focus of media attention on Boris Johnson's government. They were talking up his Russia links, which seemed rather thin actually, as a national security threat for a very long time, and seemed to have been had access to a fairly steady flow of leaks, such as communications between Johnson and the Lebedevs. So yeah, I mean, maybe in the spirit of Trump, it's purely because he is an unknown quantity and easily blackmailable that they're not particularly fond of him. I mean, what's really interesting is in some of the leaked emails that I've reported on, it's very clear that the cabal led by Dearlove, they don't want the established agencies knowing what they're doing. So they managed to get Boris Johnson's number, and they're talking about whether to send him a Signal message because he happens to be on Signal, and then Dearlove advises against it because his phones will have been frisked upon coming into office by GCHQ and backdoored. So I mean, yes, clearly they didn't want the intelligence services knowing what they were doing. It really wouldn't surprise me if this effectively represents some kind of intelligence coup against him. I mean, I don't shed any tears for his departure. I mean, we haven't yet reported on them, but we have. At Grayzone, we're in possession of emails where Paul Mason, who we'll no doubt get into, he is discussing with his British intelligence contact, or perhaps even handler, this individual called Andy Price, who was in charge of running the Integrity Initiative, which smeared Jeremy Corbyn, quite infamously, and served to, pump out ceaseless black propaganda against enemies of the state like Julian Assange and enemy governments like China and Russia. That the Price sends him through a bunch of proposed kind of campaigning and talking points right around the time that Mason announces that he's going to be running for Parliament, and he specifically, it's party political activity which is against the Civil Service Code, and for which he would lose his job if rules were actually enforced, which they're not. But there's a lot of stuff in there about how the Conservatives they're very like the Russians. They engage in five-dimensional chess, and they are bursting with disinfo. You can't trust them, and advising Mason to go big on the cost of living crisis. And then Mason's he was trying to stand in a seat in Manchester, and that didn't work out particularly well for him. Although I gather he's now running in my native Camberwell and Peckham, from my cold dead hands. But he in his campaign launch, he published a manifesto in which he seems to reiterate many of these talking points. So it very much seems that the intelligence services have their knives out for Johnson. And one might speculate that his sole purpose from the perspective of power was to ensure that Jeremy Corbyn didn't get anywhere near Downing Street. I mean, I remember the December 2019 election very well, even if it does feel like a lifetime ago. I mean, that very much felt like kind of the death knell of hope and promise in politics, and I've that kind of analysis and forecast. Nothing has occurred since then to give me much in the way of hope. Although the prospect of mass strikes in Britain is certainly appealing. So yeah, I mean, from the cabal's point of view, like I said, they got sick of him when they didn't get what they wanted, so they started looking elsewhere. And I think that again, this is a key demonstration of how power actually works. There are these cadres of unelected, largely unheard of individuals who wield an enormous amount of influence over the political process, and what you see in public is effectively the shadow that their actions cast on the outside world.
Absolutely. And what is depicted to us as a sort of healthy political culture in many cases seems to be this sort of silent and invisible civil war going on between different competing interests, sometimes within even the same agencies. Now, I understand that it was quite a while ago. The work you did on the activity of Christians United for Israel and the Zionist Federation in designating Hamas. Could you tell us a little bit about that particular piece that you published?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Kufi, as I shall, I don't like saying their full name, makes you feel sick. But yeah, in essence, they are one of the most influential Zionist lobbies in the world. They have, a direct line to lawmakers in the US and the UK. They have vast amounts of, subscribers, supporters, members, across the world who can be mobilized to influence policy. And I mean, it's funny as well because they maybe they lack self-awareness, but I mean, I got hold of some of their emails to their membership, and they openly boast about how they corralled their supporters to pressure the government to prescribe Hamas. So it gave the impression of this grassroots campaign, but they're very openly talking about how, well, we all colluded and conspired and got together to do this. So they're quite well aware that people are, their foot soldiers, as it were, are effectively automatons. I mean, I think that I'm sure that the Foreign Office and indeed the Home Office were very receptive audiences for that kind of astroturf lobbying. I mean, yes, the Home Office is occupied by Priti Patel, who was had to resign several years ago because she repeatedly lied about trips to, fully paid trips to Israel that were organized and funded by a major Israel lobbyist. The Foreign Office has for a very long time been quite heavily dominated by the Conservative Friends of Israel. Alan Duncan talks at length in his, and it's amazingly revealing quite how it got past the censors, I don't know, but in his diaries, which are probably written after the fact, he openly talks about how because of one of his few very kind of soul redeeming features was that he was very pro-Palestinian and spoke out in favor of the Palestinians in parliament and condemned Israeli atrocities. He was up for a particular role in the Foreign Office, and then when Conservative Friends of Israel and a number of other kind of Zionist front / lobbying groups caught wind of this, suddenly calls were made, tweets were posted, emails were fired off, demanding that that Boris Johnson, the then Foreign Secretary, not give him a very a specific job. I believe it was a Minister for the Americas, and because obviously given Israel's very close relationship, if not calendulous relationship with the US, that some minister in that capacity might have some wrecking ability from Tel Aviv's perspective. And so it was after many promises he was denied this role. He concludes by saying that the Conservative Friends of Israel think that they run the Foreign Office, and they do I mean, I don't think they're that omnipotent, but he's probably not far off.
Yeah, and that somebody of the prominent role in British political life, like Alan Duncan, could make such a statement and that it goes basically unremarked upon within mainstream British media, of course, articulates so much about where we are today. Well, Kit, thank you so much for a brilliant interview. I really appreciate it, and I hope that we can have you back on the Watchdog again soon. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Also to the audience, and we hope that you can support our work on Telegram, that you can also check out the website for the latest articles and investigations that we have. Thank you so much for joining us.